The Harrier jump jet is one of the most unlikely war winners ever seen. Its ability to take off and land vertically was revolutionary, but like all revolutionary inventions, it was unstable and hazardous at first. Having finally got the art of hovering right, the Harrier would take another 20 years to prove itself. But when it did, it would write history.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
The Harrier was fundamental to the Falklands. Without it, we would not have been able to set up a task force, to sail south, to do what was done.
In April 1982, it was make or break for the Harrier as the British task force began its 8,000-mile journey to retake the Falkland Islands.
There's no doubt that we couldn't have fought the Falklands campaign if we'd not had the Harrier. I mean, you're right in calling it a decisive weapon. It certainly isn't the case of the Falklands. Without the Harrier, we wouldn't have attempted to go back and reinvest the Falklands.
The protection of the British fleet and 30,000 troops would be entrusted solely to the Harrier, a plane never before tested in war, and until 1982, never ever trusted by its critics.
People did not believe it would do everything we said it would, and it didn't matter how much you flew it and what you did in front of them and how much you said, they didn't believe it. Until 1982, when the airplane was actually used down in the Falklands. And then everybody was amazed. They said, golly, it does everything you said it would. And we said, yes.
All wars are one-offs, and the Harrier was the perfect weapon for that one-off war. If the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy didn't have the Harrier and the Sea Harrier, Margaret Thatcher would have just had to bite her lip and accept that we had lost the Falklands. I think it's as simple as that.
The story of the Falklands War is the story of just 20 Harrier jump jets against a 200-strong Argentinian Air Force, and the unlikely victory of an unlikely aeroplane.
If you're going to fight a war with aeroplanes, then the first thing you've got to do is to get there. And in peacetime, you don't know where there is. There may be a road, there may be a small clearing, a car park, a small ship, a large ship. The only airplane that I know that can fly from any of those places is a Harrier.
The Harrier's purpose was to dispense with the need for runways. It is the only aeroplane in the Western world to master vertical takeoff, but it was by no means the first attempt. Vertical takeoff propulsion became a worldwide aviation obsession after World War II. The British got in first with the Flying Bedstead, a hovering Rolls-Royce engine on legs. Attempts to incorporate the principle into a functioning aeroplane would take nearly a decade of stops and starts. Even those that got off the ground didn't get much further.
Well, it certainly was a bit cranky in those early days. I started working on vertical takeoff type airplanes in the mid-50s. And I was sitting next to a guy called Ralph Hooper in the Hawker Aircraft Limited project office in 1957. And Ralph Hooper did the first drawings of what eventually became the 1127 and subsequently the Harrier. We regarded it at the time more as an interesting engineering exercise, but it turned out it has been an enormously important breakthrough.
The revolutionary principle behind the British-built Harrier was simplicity itself. 4 rotating nozzles on a jet engine, which could direct thrust downwards to achieve a hover.
This is just a single engine, where the air comes out in 4 places instead of the normal one out the back of the engine. I mean, that's just splitting it in 4 places, that's nothing. And on the end of each of these outlets, there's a rotating nozzle. And in the cockpit that I'm sitting in, I've got one lever that enables me to swivel those 4 nozzles together. But that aside, it's just anybody else's jet fighter. I mean, what a wonderful achievement.
By the mid-1960s, the Harrier was established as the only high-performance vertical takeoff aeroplane in the world. But no one would buy it. Unable to match the speed of the supersonic jet fighters of the day, the Harrier was regarded as a mere novelty. Fine for doing tricks at air shows, but when it came to combat, a jack of all trades, and perhaps master of none. Able to carry bombs, but not as many as a conventional bomber. Nimble in the air, but not as fast as a conventional jet fighter.
Initially, both the Navy and the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Air Force were, frankly, a bit hostile. It wasn't supersonic. It didn't carry a big weapon load a long distance. It was a boy's job. In fact, the phrase of the day in the end of the 50s, early 60s was, "Ha, that little thing, it couldn't carry a pack of cigarettes across a football field."
But in 1968, US Marines broke with conventional military wisdom. They bought the Harrier. The Marines were not concerned with supersonic speed. They were far more interested in the Harrier's unique ability to operate away from runways. The American purchase also alerted NATO to the Harrier's value in a potential European war.
NATO became very conscious that if there's a Warsaw Pact march west, there are very few runways, and they would be the first targets to be attacked. And so there was this hankering after an airplane that didn't really need runways.
In 1969, finally convinced of the plane's unique abilities, the RAF formed its first Harrier squadron. However, it was still not recognised as a frontline fighter. Instead, the RAF adopted the Harrier as a ground support plane, which could operate close to enemy lines without conventional runways. But even in this limited role, the Harrier quickly won the enthusiasm of its new RAF pilots.
We were attempting to put the aeroplane into an entirely new context, taking it away from airfields based on concrete and operating in the field in a way that helicopters had done, but which fighters had not. So we were Boy Scouts in the field with a high-performance jet aeroplane, and that was great fun. To fly a Harrier was the most exhilarating thing that one could experience in the world.
Now, at last, the Harrier would get its chance as a fighter, thanks, ironically, to defence cuts. In the 1970s, the Royal Navy lost its big aircraft carriers, and with them, the supersonic jets of the Fleet Air Arm. Taking their place was a new generation of smaller carriers, designed for helicopters.
The Navy put up its hands in horror. How were they going to have any sort of air defence capability at sea from fighters once they went outside the range of RAF aircraft? The Navy came up with a solution of helicopter carriers, but, surprise, surprise, you could actually operate Harriers from these. Now, suddenly, you had the possibility of naval air cover. Now, they weren't happy with this, but it was all they were going to get.
This was the Harrier's big chance. Having been shunned for years in favour of bigger, faster jets, the Harrier was to be the Royal Navy's salvation. To make it suitable for operations at sea, changes were made to the Harrier's navigational system. The Navy would be the first service to use the Harrier as a fighter. A new plane, delivered into service in 1980, was called the Sea Harrier. It fell to the pilots of the Fleet Air Arm to prove what it could do.
The first squadron was 800 Squadron, and I was very, very fortunate in being chosen to head the trials unit and then the headquarters squadron and so on. It was a very, very exciting episode of generating the aeroplane from paperwork into reality.
Having made its way into full military service despite setbacks, second thoughts and cynicism, the Harrier was now ready for its ultimate test. Just 18 months later, that test arrived.
Well, for years and years we've said what we really want is a small local war where the Harrier can show itself to advantage. Not many people killed, you know, that's cruel. And we had one, and it was called the Falklands.
British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands.
As the British task force set off, victory was far from certain. The Falkland Islands lay 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic, far beyond the range of any friendly airfield. With no conventional aircraft carriers in the fleet, the best that Britain could do was to load 2 upgraded helicopter carriers with all the Sea Harriers the Navy had. There were just 20 of them, and they would have to meet all the needs of combat, drop bombs, do air reconnaissance, provide ground support for troops on land, and after all that, take on an Argentinian Air Force and Navy of over 200 aircraft.
On the way down, it was very clear that we were short of air defence. The Air Force couldn't provide it, and we had 20 aircraft against what we were told were over 200 Argentine aircraft who would attack the fleet. Our admiral back in Somerset told the wives while we were away, on the way down, that 75% of us would not return, which is a very silly thing to do. And some of my guys thought the same. And so on the way down, we were looked upon like being given the Last Supper by some of the crew on board, until they realised how confident we were.
We knew that we had about a 10-to-1 disadvantage in the air. There are 2 ways of looking at that. There's the conventional wisdom which says you're up against very heavy odds, or there's the fighter pilot's way of looking at it, which is that it's a target-rich environment.
The fighting began on the 1st of May. Port Stanley Airfield was a crucial strategic target, a runway being used by the Argentines for delivery of supplies and the basing of offensive aircraft. The first test of war for the Sea Harriers was to bomb Port Stanley.
I came around the side of the airfield, and at that stage I saw Tracer start to come towards me, and realised that someone was actually trying to shoot down my mum's little boy. And there was a bloody great bang, and the whole aircraft started vibrating. I realised I'd been hit, and I discovered, in fact, it was a 20mm high explosive shell had gone through my tail. It made a very small, neat entry hole on the left-hand side of the fin, and then a hole the size of my head on the right-hand side. And I couldn't read any of the aircraft instruments, the vibration was so severe. But we got it back on board, and it was patched up and flying again the next morning. So that was my first taste of action. That was the famous sortie that Brian Hanrahan said in his first dispatch. He counted them all out and counted them all back.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Although the raid on Port Stanley failed to put the airfield out of action, it did enough damage to deter the Argentines from basing any of their most important aircraft there. The bulk of air missions would now have to be flown from mainland Argentina, a 400-mile flight, which would leave their aircraft with little fuel over the Falklands. Having acquitted themselves in their role as makeshift bombers, the Sea Harriers would now be tested for the first time as fighters. They were up against one of the great post-war military jets, the French-built Mirage. With twice the Harrier's speed, the Mirage was precisely the kind of supersonic specialist fighter that the Harrier was thought to be no match for. Now would come the telling contest.
In the case of the Mirage, yes, that was a fairly formidable aircraft. Had twice our speed, so that was a problem.
Faster doesn't necessarily mean better in terms of fighting capability. We used to have an adage that the supersonic aeroplanes coming towards the fleet, well, that's fine, because the quicker they got there, the quicker they'd die.
For our tactics of fighting against the enemy, we used a manoeuvre called the hook manoeuvre, which quite simply was sending one aircraft in from ahead, one aircraft from behind, and putting them in a problem. They're in a sandwich, almost like the army pincer movement. It's common sense, good strategy, good tactics, and it worked. On day 1, we shot down the first 2 aircraft using this manoeuvre.
The first 2 aircraft destroyed in the war were Mirages. Britain's pilots had been proved right, and the Harrier had finally laid to rest the myth of its inferiority against faster jets. On the opening day of air-to-air combat, the Harrier shot down a total of 4 Argentinian jets. Not a single Harrier had been lost. But even more of a problem than the enemy was the appalling South Atlantic weather. In the early hours of the 6th of May, 2 Harriers on patrol collided in thick fog. Both pilots were killed. There were now just 18 planes left.
I mean, 18 aircraft would keep the RAF going for 2/3 of a day in the Battle of Britain. if you're talking about losses, combat attrition. Now, fortunately, the RAF was able to bring in its squadron, number 1 squadron, with its 6 Harriers, and number 1 squadron did have reinforcements during the conflict.
We flew our aeroplanes direct from the UK to Ascension Island. That's about a 9.5-hour flight. We then transferred them from Ascension Island onto Atlantic Conveyor. Once we got down to the carriers, the Royal Navy then concentrated on the air-to-air portion of the war, and we concentrated on the air-to-ground, which was our specialisation.
The RAF Harriers arrived just before British troops landed on the Falklands and were able to provide vital ground support. Liberated from ground attack duties, the Sea Harriers were able to concentrate on protecting the British fleet from air attack. On the 21st of May alone, 9 Argentine attackers were shot down by Sea Harriers. Sharkey Ward got one of them in the morning. In the afternoon, he spotted an Argentine bomber flown by Carlos Tomba.
Me grita que teníamos Harrier que nos estaban atacando. Iniciamos nuestras acciones defensivas y en un momento determinado siento que el avión tiembla.
Basically, it was a no-hope situation for the Pucara because I was firing from his 6 o'clock, that's from behind him, on 3 separate runs, hitting him each time, tearing his aircraft to pieces.
El avión vuelve a moverse en todo sentido, a vibrar, y veo que el motor izquierdo se prende fuego y me quedo sin comandos.
He stayed with it until they basically had no engines, almost no fuselage, almost no wing. Then he got out at the last minute. Very brave man.
En realidad me enteré después, cuando estuve prisionero, quién era el que me había derribado. Y a través del médico que me revisó cuando caí prisionero, me enviaba sus saludos y su reconocimiento por el combate librado y su alegría porque estuviera vivo.
He represented everything good about the Argentinian Air Force. He was very brave, professional, did everything he could to save his aeroplane, but was at a disadvantage.
While the courage of the Argentine pilots was never in doubt, their tactics were.
I honestly think the Argentinian pilots were very, very poorly briefed. Perhaps if they'd actually been briefed that there was a fighter threat, and really a great threat from the Harrier, then perhaps their tactics would have been different. Perhaps they would have fought the war slightly differently.
Argentina's air commanders had ordered their pilots to concentrate on bombing the British fleet. They were to avoid engaging the Harriers at all costs. Flying without fighter escort and armed with bombs rather than air-to-air missiles, they became easy prey for the Sea Harriers.
Their command actually told them, don't engage the Sea Harrier. Big mistake. Their command should have told them, at all costs, kill every Sea Harrier you come across. Ditch your ground attack weapons. Use your guns or carry missiles. And we're prepared to take losses, providing you can kill 1 Sea Harrier for every 5 we lose. By the end of the week, the war will be over because there'll be no Sea Harriers left, or half of them left.
Cumplió un papel muy importante dentro del empleo que le dieron en el conflicto. Para nosotros era fundamental tratar de evitarlos a toda costa. Tuvimos mucha suerte. En nuestro grupo, en nuestro escuadrón, sufrimos una sola interceptación por estos aviones. Desgraciadamente fue a una escuadrilla en la cual yo integraba.
On the 5th of June, 4 Argentine Skyhawks attacked a group of British landing craft. As the first Skyhawk went in, David Morgan's Harrier intercepted.
I saw the first one drop a bomb which hit the back end of the landing craft, which made me very, very angry. Extremely angry, more angry than I've ever been in my life. And from that moment on, there was none of this bullshit about trying to shoot the aircraft down and not kill the pilot. I was going to kill that pilot.
Lanzaron 2 Sidewinder. Uno de ellos impactó de lleno en un Skyhawk, explotando en el aire.
I fired a Sidewinder missile which went straight up his jet pipe. Very large explosion, and almost nothing came out of the explosion. There was no bits larger than a dinner plate that I could see. Just a huge ball of fire, and he went into the water.
Morgan shot down 2 Skyhawks in the engagement. A third was destroyed by another Harrier. Only one of the 4 attackers escaped.
I subsequently, a couple of years ago, met the Skyhawk pilot who got away, a guy called Hector Sanchez. And I'd gone into the fight so quickly that I hadn't realized I'd overtaken him in my dive. He was actually behind me and might just have been able to get a shot at me with his gun.
Traté de disparar con mis cañones, pero se me trabaron por fallas técnicas. Así que no pude, en el momento de que ellos efectuaban el ataque a mis compañeros, no tenía con qué tirarles.
The Sea Harrier was now dominating the skies over the Falklands, and the biggest remaining concern was the terrible weather. Force 10 gales, 50-foot waves, and unrelenting rain.
The weather was very cold. As you realise, it was the Southern Hemisphere's winter. It was worse than a British winter, and we were only getting 3 hours light a day, so most operations were done in the dark. It was windy, snowing, rain. You had waves coming over the deck. Even on the Hermes, with the degree of the ramp, you had waves coming over the top.
Nuestro armamento fallaba, producto de la salinidad del medio ambiente, de la gran humedad del medio ambiente y de las bajas temperaturas. No me cabe la menor duda que hubiera sido distinto si hubiéramos tenido aviones como el Harrier, que nos hubieran permitido operar en las condiciones de Malvinas.
With such a small force of Harriers, protecting the fleet meant keeping the planes in the air around the clock.
We had 8 aeroplanes on board. We were asked to do at least half the night alert. I mean, sitting in the cockpit on deck with 1 aircraft ready to go, with 1 pilot in the crew room ready to go, fully dressed. And if you work it out mathematically, you try and do that through the night with 11 pilots is what I had. It meant that you were basically awake all night, and then you were flying all day. And then you're doing the same thing the following night. We didn't really notice that it was hard at the time, but the stress was there. I mean, I'd have 5 minutes to myself in the day. I was in tears of frustration a couple of times where things weren't going right.
Well, the Harriers were taking off all the time. We had at least 4 Harriers in the air at all time, probably even more. As soon as we got out the Falklands, we launched nearly every Harrier we had, and by the time they could come back onto the ship, they rolled them into another operation and they took off straight away without any hesitation. They just went off straight onto a different role.
We flew in 801 Squadron. I think it was 695 sorties, missions. We only missed 1 aircraft mission through unserviceability, which in any metering or any measurement in the modern world of aeroplanes or even racing cars, the same sort of thing, it's incredible, and which is why I love it so much.
On the 14th of June, during an RAF Harrier attack on Port Stanley, Argentinian forces surrendered. The Falklands War was over. The plane, which few would have chosen to depend upon in war, had proved itself. As a fighter, the Sea Harrier had shot down 23 Argentinian aircraft without losing a single plane in air combat. A further 9 Argentinian aircraft had been destroyed in ground attacks. In its unparalleled versatility as a fighting machine, the Harrier was now established as far more than jack of all trades. It was truly the master of them.
I think a lot of people were surprised at how well the Harrier performed down in the Falklands. They were surprised because they didn't know enough about the aeroplane. The people that knew it, the people that worked it, the people that engineered it, the people that flew it, they were relieved that it did what they thought it could do in war, when war came, but they weren't surprised.
I can remember saying years before the Falklands that if I ever had to go to war, then the aircraft I wanted to go to war in would be the Harrier. And I was lucky. It happened that way, and the aircraft proved itself.
The Harrier remains in frontline service today in Britain and around the world. In the Gulf War and in Bosnia, it has maintained an international combat presence. For those involved from the beginning, the Harrier has become all they had ever hoped.
We had a lot of anxieties in the earlier days, this is the late 50s, early 60s, that the aeroplane wouldn't be officially recognised and put into squadron use. And so Yes, we were sustained and we were buoyed up by the hope that our essential belief in the rightness of the aeroplane would cause it to be adopted.
Nothing symbolizes the Japanese at war as much as this weapon, the sword of the samurai.
It is the ultimate cutting weapon. It is designed to cut. It's a terrible weapon, and it will cut.
What the Colt 45 is to America, the samurai sword is to Japan, the stuff of national myth.
The Japanese sword is perfectly capable of cutting through iron plates or even other sword blades without becoming damaged.
But it is revered for more than just its pitiless beauty and deadly precision.
The sword was a weapon that represented the samurai himself. The great shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu referred to the sword as the soul of the samurai.
For this is the weapon that saved Japan from one of the most warlike empires in history, the Mongols. It seemed nothing could stop them, until in the Battle of Hakata Bay, they met the samurai armed with his sword. This was the sword that kept Japan Japanese. Before gunpowder, wars were fought with swords. But of all the thousands that have existed in history, only one remains as potent today as it did 1,000 years ago. The Japanese sword of the samurai. No other can rival it for beauty or cutting power.
For 1,000 years, swordsmen have agreed that where the cut is concerned, the best weapon is this, the Japanese sword. It has a curve to the blade, and this means that when you strike at your opponent, only one little bit of the curve reaches the target first, and then as you swing, the rest bites in, bites through, and cuts to the bone.
刀はこのくらいなら切れていかないんです。だけども刀の重さで引いたらスーッと入っていきますから、切れ味というのは紙を切ってもこういう具合に切れるんですね。こういうふうに切れるんです。
Compared to the razor-sharp Japanese sword, Western swords of the same period are crude, bludgeons.
On the Eastern Mediterranean, there were European crusaders who were fighting with a weapon like this. As you can see, it is straight-bladed, as most were, but this was basically a thrusting weapon. You actually pushed that and hoped that you pushed with enough strength to get the point into the chainmail, which was what the Europeans were used to facing when they were fighting each other. If you struck a blow with it, it's quite heavy, and although it had a sharp edge, the edge would probably not have cut much because, again, it doesn't have the curve to it, so the whole blade is landing at the same time. If you struck a blow with that, you stunned your opponent more than cut him.
But the Japanese sword has another claim to uniqueness. Sword blades can be either razor sharp or they can be resilient. The Japanese sword was both.
The whole blade itself is quite rigid. The edge is extremely hard, and one would expect it to be, in the Western sense, one would expect it therefore to be brittle. But the Japanese sword is composed of this very sophisticated laminate of a mixture of steel, so that a hard edge can be regained, which will not chip in combat.
All the other weapons of the time were purely offensive. You defended yourself not with the weapon, but with a shield, or you hoped that your helmet was strong enough and ducked. This blade always was heavy enough to knock aside an opponent's blade, to make what fencers call a beat, or indeed to make a parry. And that at the time made it unique.
Mastering the art of attack and defense, armed with sword alone, made the Japanese warrior one of the most skilled in the world. When sparring, bamboo swords are used instead of real blades. With no shield to hide behind, the swordsman had to rely on reflexes and a repertoire of brilliantly executed parries and cuts. Brute strength on its own was useless. These exercises were practiced endlessly against an imaginary opponent. The sword was the mark of a samurai. These warlords were the real power in medieval Japan, with the emperor a mere religious figurehead. The samurai's word was law, particularly on the question of swords. No one else could wear one, on pain of death.
The badge of the samurai, the mark of the samurai, was the possession of a sword and the right to wear one. So the person with the sword through his belt was a member of an elite. It was the symbol of his authority, it was the weapon with which he had been trained, it is the weapon with which he would defend his life and, if necessarily, end it in another.
In the hands of a samurai, the sword had only one purpose: to kill rivals. Duels between samurai were governed by an elaborate etiquette.
日本軍はいわば小グループのあるいは個人戦なんですね。馬に乗った、集団がお互いに名乗り合って、自分の名前を名乗るわけですね。これはどこの誰かわからないような人間と、戦ってもしょうがないと。こういう考え方からで、まず自分の名前を名乗れば向こうも、それに対して相手も名前を名乗る。そして両方誰と誰か確認した上でですね、戦うという、非常に個人戦闘と。
The secret of the Japanese sword lies in the extraordinary way in which it is made. To this day, sword makers continue to forge them in a complex process that dates back 1,000 years and yet remains one of the most sophisticated ever devised. The origins are Chinese, but it took the Japanese to perfect a technique that solved the dilemma at the heart of all sword making: how to combine a hard, sharp, cutting edge with a blade that will not break in combat. The Japanese sword maker combines hard and soft steels, which are hammered together. They are heated and folded up to 15 times, creating a layered structure in the steel. When finished, the sword can have over 30,000 layers. The steel is now stretched out and beaten gradually into its distinctive curved shape. The blade is now ready for hardening, a critical moment in the sword-making process.
When steel is hardened by quenching in water, it's able to take a very sharp cutting edge, but at the same time it becomes as brittle as glass.
To overcome this problem, Japanese swordsmiths controlled the hardening process by applying a layer of clay.
ですから粘土の厚いところは冷え方が遅くなるし、薄いところは温度の下がり方が早くなる。それによって焼きが入ったり入らなかったりして、その波紋ができるわけですからね。
The different cooling rates produce varying degrees of hardness within the blade.
The Japanese blade, because only the cutting edge is hard and the back of the blade is soft, the soft back reinforces the cutting edge and enables it to be left as hard as it possibly can be.
The clay-covered blade is reheated for the last time. This is the climax of the process. Quenching will fix forever this combination of hard and soft within the blade. The sword maker must judge precisely the right moment to remove the hot steel from the furnace. According to tradition, he waits until the metal is the color of the August moon. The finished sword is marked with a crystalline pattern in the form of a ripple along the hard edge of the blade. Called a hamon, its form and variations in texture can determine the period of the blade, as well as the swordsmith. The hamon is also valued for its beauty. Before it could be used in battle, the new sword had first to be tested.
It could be tested on a bamboo, bundles of straw, or soft metal. The most horrid test was obviously that against a living person, followed closely by testing the sword on a dead body.
The sword was now ready for the terrible purpose for which it had been designed, the settling of scores between rival samurai warlords. But against a foreign enemy, the sword was untried. All that changed when, in the late 13th century, Japan faced the most feared army in the world, the Mongol hordes. The war against the Mongols culminated in the Battle of Hakata Bay. The battle is as significant to the Japanese as the defeat of the Spanish Armada is to the English. Known as the Devil's Horsemen, the Mongol army exploded from their homelands in Central Asia and created the largest empire since the Romans. Their style of warfare was very different from the samurais.
Mongol expansion began in the early years of the 13th century. By Kublai's time, Kublai became Mongol emperor in 1260. The Mongol Empire stretched uninterruptedly from Korea in the east to Hungary in the west, the largest continuous land empire in the history of the world.
The Mongol weapon was the bow, and most people didn't get close enough to a Mongol army to find out whether they were going to be very good with their swords or not, because they were shot before they got there. Theirs was the first army to have fire in movement. They evolved tactics which were used by Rommel and Patton. They worked with tanks just as well as they worked with mounted archers.
By the end of the 13th century, all that remained for them to conquer were the islands of Japan. The Japanese had no intention of capitulating without a fight. The Mongols were perfectly happy to give them one. In 1274, a force of 40,000 Mongols crossed the sea from Korea, bound for Hakata Bay. The Japanese warriors had no idea what was about to hit them.
The Japanese, hearing of the arrival of Mongols, of course, galloped to meet them as soon as they could and were intent on singling out a suitable opponent, and preferably someone of high rank.
The whole of the tradition of the elite samurai warrior was based around the desire to meet a worthy opponent in battle, to challenge him to single combat, and to win a glorious victory. And we know from the records of the time, this is initially what the Japanese expected to do with this strange and terrible enemy who had just landed on their shores. But there was one slight problem. The Mongols didn't speak Japanese.
Their swords had proved useless against the marauding archers. With no regard for etiquette, the Mongols swept the samurai aside.
It must have created enormous terror. And then night fell, illuminated only by the burning buildings. The Mongols chose to spend the night on their ships rather than on land. And that was when the great surprise happened for the Japanese. Because when dawn broke, they walked back to the beach, wondering where the Mongols were, and they'd all gone.
It was normal Mongol practice prior to invading a new part of the world to send some kind of reconnaissance in force before mounting a full invasion. It's possible to see this first invasion of Japan as some kind of reconnaissance expedition.
The Japanese gave thanks for what they saw as divine intervention. But they knew that the Mongols would be back. The samurai would keep faith with their swords, but a new way of fighting was needed. A defensive wall was built at Hakata Bay, and the etiquette of the personal challenge was dropped. Next time, there would be no place for manners. 7 years later, the Mongols turned their attention to Japan once more, calling for their surrender. The Japanese made their defiance clear.
The Japanese, encouraged by the withdrawal of the Mongol force in 1274, got into the habit of executing Mongol envoys. This was a particularly heinous crime in Mongol eyes. They regarded the person of an ambassador, especially one of their own, as absolutely sacred, and this really left Kublai with no alternative but to invade as soon as circumstances permitted.
The result was inevitable. In 1281, the Mongols launched a second invasion fleet, even larger than the first. They expected little resistance.
The skies went dark with the arrows from the Mongol troops. At the same time, the Mongol troops advanced on them, shoulder to shoulder, with spears lowered. The samurai met them from behind their defensive wall, and this time managed to force the Mongols back to take refuge on their ships. Because the line held and the Mongols weren't able to force their way inland, the Japanese then were able to take the fight to the Mongol ships themselves.
This time, the Japanese would fight the battle that most suited their swords. Not on the open beaches, where the Mongol archers could hold them off at a distance, but on the confined space of the ship's decks. It was a masterstroke.
The Japanese would go in small boats of perhaps 12 or 15 people in a boat and launch night raids on the Mongol ships lying at anchor. These boats would be rowed out into the middle of the bay, close with the Mongol ships. The mast would be let down as a sort of ladder on which they could climb on board, and then with their sharp swords, the samurai were there to attack the Mongols on board the ships.
The Mongol sword, although very useful on a horse, I think that this could have been a problem against a Japanese sword, because one, I mean, this has no strength to it at all, and it's not designed for meeting the opponent's blade. So one good beat from a Japanese sword, that will be out of the way long enough for you to be dead. If it was sword to sword, the invaders didn't have much of a chance.
These tactics kept the Mongols on their ships for 4 weeks, unable to establish a beachhead. The Mongol hordes had been halted, but the coup de grace would be delivered not by the Japanese sword, but by the volatile Japanese climate.
いうふうに言われまして、大きな台風がよく来る日として警戒されている日なんですが、ちょうどこの1281年もですね、大きな台風が襲ってきました。そのため、この14万の大軍を乗せた、何千艘の、モンゴルの軍団が、散々な大変な被害を受け、多くが沈み被害を受け、そうして、海上をさまよう、そういう状態になりました。これが日本でいう神風。
The Mongols could not land. The Mongols could not find a friendly harbour. The Mongols had to sit there and experience the wind and the waves and the ships smashing against each other. Some sources speak of casualties approaching 90% in some of the contingents of the Korean or Mongol armies.
Such troops as remained on the coast, now of course much reduced in numbers, were captured or killed by the Japanese forces. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Mongols.
The Mongols would never return. Having beaten off this terrifying enemy, the Japanese would come to venerate their swords. For the next 500 years, the Japanese prized them over all other weapons. So complete was their faith in the cutting power of their razor-sharp blades that even when gunpowder and muskets should have made swords obsolete, the Japanese refused to give them up.
A myth, a legend, a belief, an act of faith almost grew that the Japanese samurai, who grew more and more to be personified by the samurai sword, was the match for anything that anywhere else in the world could throw at them. The arrival of the Europeans in the 16th century, bringing muskets that fired bullets, they were withstood. The brave individual samurai with his sword were absorbed into Japanese culture to such an extent that these firearms themselves could almost be rejected in favour of the Japanese sword as the superior weapon, superior not only in military terms, but superior in moral terms.
But the samurai spirit had a darker legacy. During the Second World War, the Japanese sword became infamous, identified forever with atrocities committed against Allied prisoners of war.
Probably the most active use of the Japanese sword during the Second World War was beheading Allied prisoners. The killing of prisoners, whether it is done by a samurai sword or not, was totally out of step with all the samurai tradition into which those people had supposedly been initiated.
It was left to post-war Japan to try and rescue the spirit of the samurai and his sword from those terrible years. For the great film director, Akira Kurosawa, they are as potent a part of Japanese myth as cowboy films are to America. His most famous film, The Seven Samurai, supplied the blueprint for one of the greatest westerns ever made, The Magnificent Seven. The samurai sword may no longer be used in anger, but it lives on as a collectible work of craftsmanship and for use in the martial arts. Strictly controlled by the Japanese government in terms of number and quality, they are still made with the same reverence as the swords that won the Battle of Hakata Bay. Testimony to a weapon which refuses to become a relic.